everyone for joining us. I'm really excited about this class. We met Joran when we were preparing for the Building the New World conference, and I have to say, this was my favorite workshop, so I'm glad to be sharing it again. Joran is located in Florida. He's a author, musician, and interfaith minister, and the founder of Integral Church, which is a pretty nifty little group. So he's a part of the St. Petersburg Interfaith Association, an ambassador for the Parliament of World Religions. He served as a teacher and a retreat facilitator, and he speaks about topics from marketing to spirituality, and I think he's just an amazing person. So before I stutter anymore, I will hand it over to him.
Katie, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And yeah, this presenting this at the Building the New World conference was huge for me because it was really the first time I had presented on the topic of integral spirituality, which was exciting for me to be able to pull all those notes and all those teachings together into one presentation, and also in the live setting at the event. What we did was I was able to co-present, thanks to Laura, I was able to co-present with Amy Edelstein, which was an amazing opportunity to get to know her and to deepen our relationship and learn from each other about what we were doing. And so from me on the integral spirituality side and her on the evolutionary spirituality side, it was a nice little game of ping pong up there as we presented these concepts for the people who happened to be in the room with us that day. And so yeah, it was great. And we had Barbara Marx Hubbard, right there down in the front row, and really engaged and asking all these really great questions, and it was just a fun day. It was a great opportunity, and I continue to be grateful to all of you, to Laura, Katie, everybody, Steve, everybody that made that event happen and have invited me to come and be a part of that conference. So I am excited too to revisit this because I haven't taught this class or done this presentation since then, and that was many months ago. So I'm excited to get back into it as well. So I'm also really appreciative to the people who are here on the call. Just appreciative that you've chosen to spend your Saturday afternoon with us, and I know that there are many other things to be doing. There's a lot more work to be done in the world, and the fact that you carved out a couple hours to spend means a lot. And also want to acknowledge the fact that this is some pretty esoteric and high-level stuff that we're going to be getting into, and so I just kind of want to make mention that it's awesome that we're part of this little group that can convene around these topics and have some conversation. And we will be having some conversation. I do have, some things to go through as far as the presentation itself, and I'll try to keep that relatively short. I don't want it to feel like you're sitting here watching a movie. I want it to be fun and interactive and engaging. And if at any time there are questions, I encourage anybody to just kind of type in the chat window your questions as they come up, and then what we can do is during break or at the end, I'll go through the written questions kind of in order. So to get right into it, I'd like to go ahead and let's start with the next slide. Katie's running my slides for me, so we'll move to the first slide here, which is a picture of the Game of Thrones. And for anybody who hasn't seen the show Game of Thrones, it's a fascinating story, a fascinating and bloody telling of a culture evolving, right? A culture changing over the course of time. What I come away with from Game of Thrones is the fact that it's basically the story of an entire world moving from one form of religion to another. There are a few different threads happening throughout the storyline. One of them is a shift from kind of a nature-based tribal form of religion that what we would now call kind of polytheistic, and moving into what looks like to us a monotheistic structure. There are priesthoods and caste systems emerging and beginning to take control of certain parts of the region that are then forcing their religion on the outlying territories. One of the Lord of Light, which is this new monotheistic character that's kind of emerging, likes to be praised through the blood and fire of human sacrifice, and so a lot of what happens in the show is related to pleasing the one true God. So I want to talk about how the religion evolves over time a little bit today. I want to talk about how we come through these nature-based and tribal religious structures into more traditional and conformist religious structures, into a little more inclusive and egalitarian, communitarian structures, and then even into the cosmocentric or mystical structures that exist, and all of those, like I said, still exist today. So as an example, we'll be talking about a little bit about integral spirituality kind of as a baseline or as a foundation to give the journey some context. So we can move to the next slide, and I want to talk a little bit about integral spirituality as a lineage. It's a specific lineage that goes back to India and Sri Aurobindo in the 1930s. It's been woven through our culture and handed down to various teachers over time. It moved to the West, landed in California with Dr. Haridas Chaudhuri in the California Institute for Integral Studies. It was then handed on to teachers like Michael Murphy and Alan Watts, who were deans and instructors at the Institute. It was present in the teachings of Jean Gebser, and then in around 1995, it was repopularized. This idea of using specifically the word integral was showed back up on the scene when the transpersonal psychologist and philosopher Ken Wilber wrote a book called Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality. And so that's when we began to see a really well-articulated version of what an integral theory, an integral philosophy, and an integral spirituality might look like. It is, like I said, it's a specific thing when we talk about the integral spirituality line, but there is a line of evolutionary spirituality that, predates any of this, and it has more in common with philosophy and science and these things being synthesized together, and that's been emerging for hundreds of years. That can be found in the writings and the teachings of Arthur Koestler, who theorized that all things are holons, right? All things are wholes, but they're also parts simultaneously. It shows up in Alfred North Whitehead, who was the creator and founder of what's called process theology, who basically just stated at the time that, and this is 1920s, this was, early 20th century, Whitehead stated that the science was basically, that they had it wrong, that that nature was not atomistic, that the reality was not made up of a set of building blocks, that actually instead nature and reality was composed of a set of processes, a continuum, a series of unfolding moments. And it's the relation of those unfolding moments that compose reality, not a set of discrete and separate measurable blocks. That's what Whitehead contributed. And then there was Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who in the 1950s proposed the idea that not only we have the biosphere, this idea that life is emerging or being born out of the planet, but that then he predicted the noosphere that was emerging at the time, which was human consciousness that continues to emerge kind of as a layer or a bubble around the biosphere. And there's also the technosphere, and as we start to witness things like the internet come onto the scene, we're starting to see this kind of fusion of the noosphere, pure consciousness, with the technosphere, which is the connectivity of that consciousness, and we started to see this new form take shape. And what Desjardins predicted was that we would reach an omega point. We would reach a point where the emergence of consciousness would collapse upon itself, and it would be an infinite loop. And so that, for him, was the Christ experience. Like, that was Christ consciousness emerging on the planet, was what he called omega. So you have this idea of evolution, you have this idea of unfolding that is present throughout all of these teachings. You've got Aldous Huxley, who wrote about the perennial philosophy and the similarities between all the religious traditions, and it also continues to show up through Ralph Waldo Emerson and the Transcendentalists. It shows up in Jung and the evolution of archetypes. It shows up in some of the modern Christian teachers like Michael Dowd, who wants to really retell the story of evolution, the real true scientific telling of evolution, as a new mythology. His argument being that the actual scientific telling of the events is no less awe-inspiring or mystical than a biblical reading of it. So you have Matthew Fox, you have John Shelby Spong, you have contemplatives like Thomas Merton and Richard Rohr and Thomas Keating, who are continuing to kind of, along the Christian line of things, continue to push and into these new, broader territories. And even as far as Christianity goes, there are Christian ministers recently like Tom Thresher and Paul Smith who have even gone so far as to introduce the term integral Christianity to the world. And so if we move to the next slide, all of this, integral spirituality, process theology, evolutionary spirituality, universal values, all of it's called many different things by many different people. But basically what we're talking about is bringing into balance some of the things that have long been held as opposites, right? We think about things being polar or being separate and discrete from one another, things like Eastern and Western thought, science and spirituality. These things just are held separately, right? The inner world and the outer world, the masculine and the feminine, being an individual and being part of a larger group. Things like grasping and sitting, things like ascending versions of religion where you are reaching up to return to source, to return to God, or descending versions of religion where God is reaching down or breathing life into the world. These two philosophies, these two schools have been held separately for so long, and basically what we're talking about doing, next slide please, is introducing a spirituality of both and not of either or. It's pluralism in practice, right? It's the idea that you can hold two ideas at one time, and that's something we do every day, but we never think of applying it, or most times don't think of applying it to our own religious life or to our own spiritual practice. And so pluralism in practice for me, especially with the founding of Integral Church, means and looks like honoring the differences in the various faith traditions and bringing them to the table in a way that gives respect and provides a space for deep listening for these stories and for the shared meaning, for the traditions, for the ritual and practices that are imbued in all these paths, all these traditions, and looking at them not so much as various paths up a mountain, right, or different, that these all arrive at the same point. There's the idea in the world that we're all arriving to the same point philosophically, right, or spiritually, that we're all connected, and there's this sense of universal or spiritual oneness in all the world religions. To some degree, that's true. As we'll see, it depends on how you map them. But for the most part, we really need to hold these religious traditions in context and also look at the really rich and meaningful differences that they have. And that's what a pluralistic approach can provide us. It provides us the understanding that while there is a distinct and very clear and very well documented theology in a tradition like Christianity, something like Buddhism doesn't really have a theology. There is no belief in God. There's no non-belief in God. The path of inquiry that takes you down the road of asking questions about God and why we're here and what's our purpose and what was first cause and what came first, the chicken or the egg, and that line of inquiry, according to Buddhist teachings, is suffering. right? So we, by asking the question at the outset, create our own suffering. And so in Buddhism, you see this really distinct lack of any theology. And so to compare things theologically sometimes gets us in trouble, especially when we're talking about formal structures like liturgy or religious leadership or hierarchy, and asking leaders to come to around the table and discuss things and participate in interfaith dialogue. There are communities like Christian Science where there are really no selected leaders. There are people who are identified as readers who will read from a book, but there is no such thing as clergy in Christian Science. There's also the Quakers who there's no hierarchical structure with the Quaker movement either. They really tend to make decisions in a space of silence and what's called a sense of the meeting. So we really need to look at the differences, really need to make it, take a real close look at what makes these different paths, these different traditions, these communities really special and unique. So we've got to look at things like their cultural history. We've got to look at their creative acts, their mythology, their storytelling methods. Look at their history of human rights and freedoms, struggle for freedoms, and look at their specific communities and modes of practice. And so something that's an integrative approach or a pluralistic approach allows us to do that and to maintain a respect for the individual traditions. So integral theory will attempt to integrate some of these things as far as the stories we tell, as far as the individual and developmental approaches we take towards them, the attitudes we hold towards one another in a spiritual context, but it also attempts to integrate some other things too, which is really what sets integral theory apart and integral spirituality apart from the pack. It starts to integrate things like states of awareness, which is our bodily awareness, how we kind of wake up, and our stages of consciousness, which has been called how we grow up, things that happen in individuals and cultures, how things developmentally unfold. It looks at lines of development, things like our cognitive or moral or interpersonal or aesthetic or athletic or kinesthetic or ethical lines that we all have and that we all move along separately. Some of those lines are more developed than others. They're also called lines of intelligence. We all have multiple intelligences, and some of those lines are, shown a little more love than the others and tend to grow faster than the others. So they also look at personality and gender types, things like masculine, feminine, as it sits in relation to something like the biological terms male and female. We look at gender identity. We look at types also when it comes to personality types like the Enneagram or using Chinese or Indian astrology to determine types. Types also refers to things like the DISC assessment or Myers-Briggs, the Kabbalah. There's all kinds of typologies that can be considered when discussing types. So we want to discuss two of those today. We want to discuss, and you can go to the next slide, we want to first discuss stages of consciousness. This is how we grow up, right? How we unfold and developmentally move through the world as individuals and also as a culture. So we want to look at stages and we want to look at states and where those intersect. So first we'll drill down into stages, and the model that we'll be using, you can go ahead to the next slide, the model that we'll be using today is going to be spiral dynamics, which was developed in 1996 by Don Beck and Chris Cowan. And before spiral dynamics came on the scene, there existed something in the early 90s, which was ECLET, E-C-L-E-T, which was an early version of spiral dynamics. Now, Beck and Cohen went on to kind of flesh this out and really give it detail, plot it along a spiral, apply some colors to it, and determine that the spiral weighed on one side a little more toward individual concern, and on the other side of the spiral weighed a little more towards a concern for the collective or the group. Now that's what provides the spiral model with its polarity, right, as we move between any of these things, between faith and practice and east and west and all these polarities. What provides that kind of center of gravity is us being drawn toward one or the other, right? We're either concerned for the individual self, or we're concerned for the good of the group or the tribe. And so I kind of have this image set on its side, but if you can imagine it's kind of standing upright, you'll see it kind of ever widening through time, beginning with here on the left you have archaic. These are value systems that Beck and Cohen have come to define as, let's see, we started about 100,000 years ago with archaic, right? This is the primal, instinctive, you've got to eat, you've got to survive, you're looking for food and warmth, you're looking for sex and safety. Those are the concerns at the archaic level, at the archaic value system. So that's clearly a concern for the individual. And as you move slightly to the right, you'll see it swings over to the collective. This is what, according to spiral dynamics, is called the tribal stage. It's colored using purple. This is where you start to see a loyalty to the tribe. You see magical and animistic beliefs. Family rituals, blood oaths, nature religions start to show up. You start to see a group of people observing collective customs and cycles as relates to nature or the world, the environment around them. And at tribal, when sacrifices are made for the tribe. The scope rarely ever goes beyond the immediate family or group of people. And that emerged 50,000 years ago. And then you see the warrior stage emerge. Now this is where impulsive and egocentric beliefs start to dominate the culture. You'll see a heavy emphasis on self-interest, self-expression. Here's where the strong survive. You see a lot of domination by force. You see rebellion against the forces in play. Kingdoms and heroes emerge, right? And this isn't just ancient culture we're talking about. The spiral continues to unfold today. Every time a culture begins to bloom or an individual is born. And so a red warrior stage could show up in modern times as gangs, right? People looking for dominance over a group and finding themselves falling in with a gang. You could even say the Terrible Twos is an example of this extreme self-interest, this extreme self-expression stage. But the warrior stage, as spiral dynamics points out, it creates change in the world, but it creates change through the use of power. And then moving to blue, or traditional, you see the authoritarian beliefs start to be written down, right? You see law and order start to take hold. You see the ideas of a polarized good and evil start to emerge. You start to see mythic and literal interpretations. You start to see a more ethnocentric culture. You might hear the words, my country, right or wrong, at this stage. And some of the upsides of a traditional culture is going to mean a more ordered and a more meaningful, sometimes albeit a more litigious existence. But there is law. There is good and evil, right and wrong. There's absolute truth. There's rightful living. Now, it's sacrifices that are made at blue, or the traditional stage. The sacrifices at blue are made for truth, right? They're made for the sake of truth. And this is going to come into play when the written word or in a religious setting starts to show up. Moving into orange, or the modern stage, you start to see self-reliance, a swing back to self-interest. You start to see the rational and scientific worldview. This is what's called also achievist or strategist level. This is where the belief is life is a game, right? If I know the rules of the game, I can win, right? So you see risk-taking. You see a lot of positives in modernity. You see the Enlightenment. You see the Industrial Revolution. You see a lot of stuff happening at orange that is really was great at the time, right? Modernity was a blessing in many ways. Technology, for one, the printing press. There's a lot of things that happen in the modern era, which started, 300 years ago, which in many ways are blessings and in many ways great things. There are also downsides to modernity. There are also negative things like capitalist exploitation and the devastation of the environment. You also tend to see at Orange, this modern level, you start to see a kind of a mechanistic view of life and the universe and of biology, right? Because as you see the realms of science, the domains of science and that language take over the scene, a lot of that creeps into the other value spheres, right? So we not only look at our bodies as machines, we look at the earth as a machine that has this self-generating mechanism, right? We look at the universe as a giant clock with gears that are just spinning around. And so this mechanistic view can tend to be a negative aspect of modern thought if we are not constantly kind of keeping that machine oiled and maintaining it, right? If we just put the responsibility on the clockmaker and don't take responsibility for maintaining the clock, then that could be a negative to the modern era. Modern Orange creates change in the world, but it creates change through manipulation, right? You move from power, creating change with power at Red, to creating change using manipulation at Orange. So you see it moving from egocentric to ethnocentric, right? It's connected more to the society, and it uses that society to its own gain. And then we swing to green, which is postmodern, and you start to see some, you think of hippies, you think of the peace and the love movement, you start to think of communitarian and egalitarian societies, more world-centric thinking. You start to see the emergence of initiatives for world peace or social justice, human rights, deep ecology, religious pluralism, multiculturalism, communes. All of these things start to emerge at green, where why can't we all just get along? Positives at green are obviously the birth of the internet, which we've already talked about, and communes that work, right? There are some communities that work and some that don't. Some of the negatives at green could be a real hatred of hierarchies, right? There's this attitude, there's this disdain against any kind of authority, any sense of hierarchical structure at green, and so we tend to kind of tear that down, and there's also a disdain for any real sense of competition in the postmodern world, and so that can be a negative, right? Because somebody's got to lead, somebody's got to facilitate. And sacrifices at green are made for consensus, right? Like we talked about the Quakers making their decisions in silence. A lot of that starts to happen at green. Sacrifices are made for the consensus of the group. As long as it's good for the group, we'll sometimes bite our tongue even though we're choking on blood in the postmodern era. And then as we move from green to yellow, you start to see what Jean Gebser and Don Beck and many other people have called the integral stage of development. Now, moving from green to yellow is important because not only is it the move to a more integrative way of thinking, it's an enlightened version of self-interest. It's on the individual side of the spiral, but it's a little more pragmatic. So it's important to notice the shift from green to yellow, not only because of that, but also because yellow, or the integral or integrative stage, it's said, is the very first stage, according to spiral dynamics, where you can include all previous stages, right? So if you move from blue to orange, if you move from a traditional, let's say, hierarchical and strictly religious environment to orange and modern and scientism and achievism, and you turn to atheism in your shift from blue to orange, you are going to completely reject everything that came before. You're not going to give respect to nature religions or cultures other than your own. you're going to really root down and dig deep into that modern orange level and think that everything that came before that is less than, or weaker than, or more insignificant. And at the yellow stage, the integral stage, it's reported to have the ability to transcend and include, right, to give validity to all previous stages. So if you view these as concentric circles, it is the stage that allows all the circles to kind of freely float in the middle and incorporate in a healthy way, not in a pathological way, in a healthy, synthesizing way, all the stages that previously came before. So at yellow or integral, we see the emergence of flexibility, functionality, responsibility, the idea that all value systems themselves are valid. We rank things probably at yellow more holarchically than hierarchically. You start to see more values-based hierarchies show up, things that are that provide more goodness, more beauty, more truth for the world. You start to see systems thinking and third-way politics and everything at yellow. Well, it's creating change. It's using knowledge, right? So not by using power at red or manipulation at orange, but change is created at yellow using knowledge. And then we move to turquoise, which is the mystical stage of development. Now this is where you start to see a more holistic worldview. You start to see a real balanced system of these kind of processes and flows and interlocking forces, like we talked about Whitehead's process theology. You start to see body, mind, spirit approaches to any experience. You start to see global networks and global solutions emerge. Individuals may start to identify with a collective mind or a collective unconscious or unified way of being, an evolving whole, right? And sacrifices at turquoise are made for the planet, or are made for all beings, not for consensus at green and not for the truth at blue. They are made for all living beings. And this mystical stage is reported to just beginning to emerge about 30 years ago. And then, according to spiral dynamics, there is an emerging stage that is choral, which we're just starting to see emerge now on this planet. So that's spiral dynamics in a nutshell. And I want to then move on to, now that we've talked a little bit about stages of consciousness, now I want to talk about states of awareness. Excuse me while I grab a drink of water here. Now, states of awareness, these are typically what we refer to as the self. We refer to them in some cultures as bodies. Sometimes they're referred to as sheaths or koshas, right? These are the physical bodies that kind of expand or deepen outward to include more energy, like chi or prana, spirit. So this is, if you have the next slide, this is where you start to see how we wake up, right, as opposed to how we grow up. This is how we become more aware, beginning with our gross body, our sensory awareness, our waking bodily state, then moving outward to our subtle body, right? That would be our extrasensory awareness, our energetic body. This would be the chi, the shen, the prana, the chakras beginning to emerge. You also illustrated by dreaming states or altered states, entheogenic altered states. And then the causal body, you start getting into more formless awareness achieved through practices like centering, prayer, yoga, meditation. This would be, some call it the soul, Aurobindo called it the supermind, and then all the way over to non-dual or witnessing awareness, which is like extremely to the right of this map, and that is sometimes referred to as Turiyatita, spirit. Atman is the ground of being, right? It is the state that is all states. So this spectrum kind of horizontally, from gross to subtle to causal, which is our states of awareness, in connection to the kind of vertical, if we will, stages of consciousness, which is how we grow up or unfold, is what we're going to be looking at today. Now, the thing to be aware of is that someone can be at the highest peak state, right? They can be blissed out in a state of rapture. They can be walking around while in a just blissful, divine, supreme meditative state, right? Holding love for the world. But they can themselves be at a traditional, right, if we go back to our spiral dynamics, a traditional or ethnocentric stage of development, right, at a blue value system or even lower. And the opposite is also true. You can have a higher value system and just be walking around in this kind of really immanent bodily awareness and not have tapped into any of these more energetic or broader bodies or states of awareness. And so the examples here might be like an enlightened Zen master, right, who is truly really inhabiting these higher states of awareness, right? And you might have a highly developed line of morality, might have a highly developed ethical line. He might be generous, he might be humble, but that same person could hold a traditional or lower stage of consciousness, right? He might hold cultural biases, right? He might have racist or homophobic beliefs. And so you can see where you can have a leader who is really skilled along one line or is really tapped into these higher states, but that is unable to move themselves beyond the stage that would bring them in line with the state that they're in. So it's important to note here that all states are accessible from all stages, and that how we move through them, right, how we balance our ability to grow up and wake up really happens along this kind of fulcrum, along this kind of polarity process that moves us along the spiral and helps us to unfold our own states of awareness through practice, right, through our own spiritual practice and development of spiritual tools. And I could just have to say thank God for the internet, you know, here in the kind of postmodern integral age where people are able to kind of synthesize and integrate all this knowledge and see it presented in a contextual and new way that puts it in their hands and gives them the tools to do these things. I want to read a little bit from Alan Combs. He wrote in his book, The Radiance of Being, he wrote that the idea that people interpret and describe their experiences of states of consciousness differently according to their own developmental level opens the door to a better understanding of why spiritual or religious encounters seem so different for different people. For instance, a magical or purple individual, say in a tribal setting, might experience the visitation of a nature or animal spirit, while a mythic or blue individual will report a vision of Christ or one of the saints or perhaps Shiva. And someone at the turquoise level or beyond might report that the world just took on a divine crystalline aspect in which everything just seemed for the moment to be just so. And so you can see where the same experience, right, could be translated or interpreted differently at these various stages according to the state of awareness that the experiencer is at. So what's our next slide there, Katie? Our next slide is the intersection, right? So as we think about where our states horizontally intersect with our stages vertically, Ken Wilber refers to this as our cosmic address, right? And our cosmic address is always shifting. It's always changing. It's always in process. It's always unfolding. It's always transcending and including. And we're never standing still. It's interesting that Whitehead, in developing his process philosophy, pointed out that it's improper to give ourselves proper names at different stages of unfoldment. right? Say 3 years old, my name is Joran, but when I turn 14, I don't get a new name. When I become somebody new, the proper name remains. And so we need to think about ourselves in a spiritual context as always unfolding, always blossoming, always pushing open from within, pushing into these new states, and fighting the societal habit of labeling, fighting the personal practice of our own ego, keeping us in check, keeping us identified as a self, identified as an individual, identified along with a certain identity or a specific essence that is unchanging, and kind of come to this realization that we are always changing, right? And if we need to give ourselves new proper names, then so be it, right? If I want to put a, like we were talking about before the call, if I want to put a hyphen in my name and change it from Joran to Joran and be more like a, you know, from the planet Krypton, then that's my prerogative. I should be able to do that. So let's move into a case study. I want to talk a little bit about Christianity as a case study for these set of tools, and because I want to get to some discussion around these ideas as well. As far as my personal journey goes, I 5-6 years ago was a member of Unity Church here locally. I would go on a 2-year path to become a chaplain. I would be in the chaplain program for a couple of years, and then I would decide to branch out kind of onto my own and found the Integral Church because I like to say that while I had a deep and meaningful and daily relationship with Christ, it just simply was not a monogamous relationship, right? I needed Buddha in my life, and I needed Lakshmi in my life, and I needed a whole other host of spiritual tools and teachings in my life to be complete, right? To carry with me the complete human experience as revealed through spiritual teaching. So I decided to move out on my own and plant my own church, the church that is not a church, the church that is more resembles Unitarian Universalism than anything, but without the kind of top-down, one-to-many hierarchical worship experience. It's more of a peer-to-peer, inward-facing, postmodern experience, kind of like what Napster did to the music industry. We're trying to do to religion. So I went out and planted my own flag in a city park and decided to do some stuff outdoors, more in touch with nature, and thus began that path with Integral Church. But I learned a lot about the Unity School of Christianity when I was training there, and I made a lot of important discoveries specific to Christianity, because I was raised in a Christian church. I was raised in a UCC church, in a small church in Medford, Wisconsin. And so when my grandmother would force me to go and force me into, you know, vacation Bible school and all that stuff, so I was exposed to those Old Testament stories very early, and would then rebel against that in my adolescent years before ironically returning to it later. But I learned a lot about the history of Unity and what attracted people to Unity Church, what attracts people to New Thought, which New Thought is something that includes religious science, Christian science, unity. People who, like me, wanted something that was a religious expression that was inclusive of more than just Christianity, right? They're wanting something that is a little more green, a little more pluralistic. You'll see in a Unity Church, you might see a statue of Buddha in a classroom, or you might see, you know, not the word Namaste displayed up in the hallway somewhere as you walk in. And so Unity is a very welcoming environment in practice. But on paper, it is a very specific Christian lineage. It was founded in the 1920s by Charles and Myrtle Fillmore. It was referred to by them as practical Christianity. It was a study of the revelation of Jesus as a divine teacher, the supreme metaphysician, the ultimate healer, and the teachings of Jesus are presented in unity churches as the, I want to say probably in a very yellow and turquoise way, right? In a very integral and mystical way. There are some interpretations of Scripture in unity churches that would, just get the blood boiling of your local Southern Baptist or evangelical. And so there's this very clear spectrum within Christianity that includes, Catholicism and Methodism and, mainline Protestants and Lutheranism and the Seventh-day Adventists, and as well as the contemplatives and the mystical schools. There's, I've been fortunate enough to spend some time with some Benedictine and some Franciscan brotherhoods and orders when I've been on retreat. And, it's just such a rich tapestry. The Christian lineage or tree has branches that range everywhere from this literal interpretation of Scripture and to the very liberal and metaphysical and spiritualist interpretations. And that's not even including like Mormonism and some of the more outsider kind of exiled teachers like Richard Rohr and John Shelby Spong. So all of these structures kind of exist because their center of gravity and their ability to attract those bodies, those minds, and souls around this specific Christian value system. We've got to consider that if there were no maladaptation, right, to these structures, if there were no evolution happening within the Christian line, there'd be no growth, there'd be no new ideas, there'd be no pushing back against the hierarchy, there'd be no violent schisms or splits, or there wouldn't even be healthy reformations from within. It would just be static. And so these new forms of Christianity are born every year, born every day. Christianity as a whole just continues to evolve, and it's amazing, and it's just one of many religions on the planet that are doing that exact same thing. So what I want to do is take Christianity and give an example at each of these stages, at each of these value systems, and give an example as we work through the model of spiral dynamics. Let's connect it to the stage of consciousness, and let's talk about the peak state of awareness, the peak experience at that stage, and what that might look like. So we'll talk about Christ, we'll talk about Jesus, we'll talk about the symbology of the cross, all in the context of spiral dynamics and integral spirituality. So let's go ahead and move to the first stage, which is, well, the second stage, which is tribal. We're skipping archaic, right, because we're just killing and eating at that stage. So the second stage, tribal, purple, magical stage. Now clearly, this is a pre-Christian stage of consciousness, right? This is historically, this stage precedes the emergence of Christ on the scene. So we're starting to see tribal readings of Christianity, but basically if we're talking about a purple structure or version of the Christian teachings, we're really talking about the Gnostics or the Desert Fathers, right, who are kind of on the outlying society. You'd have to study with a teacher for years before your enlightenment was revealed to you. Very different from the church we now know. But at a tribal level, Jesus is the ideal shamanic leader, right? He's the ideal healer among the tribe. And from a modern tribal reading, the crucifix would be would be viewed with much superstition, because at the tribal level, symbols themselves hold power, right? Inanimate objects themselves hold a lot of power. There's an actual spirit in the rock. There's an actual spirit in the river. So there's an actual spirit in the cross, in the crucifix. And so whatever the symbology of the cross is at the purple tribal level, you view it with much wariness, right? Considering it killed somebody, there'd probably be some fear involved in that. Now, a peak experience at tribal might involve more nature-based forms. It might be something like the tree of life or the burning bush. And you might even see, especially among the Gnostics and the Desert Fathers, the Desert Mothers, you might actually see more either gender balanced or female-centric expressions of God, in the case of Shekinah or divine wisdom, the divine feminine. I know for me, when I was on I was about 3 years old and on an airplane, and I looked out the window of the airplane. My grandmother leaned over and she said, what do you see outside the window? And I just saw that, for as far as I could see, this billowy field of clouds, and I just looked at her and I said, it's heaven, Grandma. And I remember the sense that if I could walk out the window, I would literally be able to walk on those clouds and eventually get to a place where there were people hanging out. You know, that was just a very real sense of the physical universe there was heaven. Above the earth was heaven, you know, at that stage. And so that's my purple experience. Let's move on to red as we move to warrior values, right? Again, this is where you start to see some pre-Christian values, but very clear that this value system, the warrior value system, is how religion itself spreads, right? So the leaders at the time might have been more blue, but they put in place red values so that they could spread the teachings and spread more than that across the globe. This is where you start to see the emergence of a very monotheistic, paternal, wrathful Father God that we know very well from the Old Testament. You start to see demands of allegiance and the loyalty to a tribe or a kingdom, all based on somebody being Supreme Lord. And a peak experience might actually be that Lord, that Savior, appearing to you, or that Father God appearing to you, parting the clouds, and giving you secret instructions that you are then to turn around and take back to the people. That peak experience is what that looks like at the red stage. Let's move on to blue. At blue, or the traditional level, this is where you start to see the emergence of the Word, right? Because this is where we need a little more conformity. We need a little more formal structure to things, so we start to write things down, and you're starting to see emergence of the truth in form of the Word, in form of the Word of God. Jesus is the actual Son of God. The cross is the symbol of Jesus' actual and physical resurrection and his very real victory over sin and death. This is where sin is very real in the world. Jesus is the only way to salvation. He is the way, the light. He is the way. He is the path. He is the Lord and Savior. And good and evil exists in the world. Satan is tempting us at every corner, and we need to commit and give our lives over to Jesus and to God, because this is how we will reach salvation, attain salvation, and be with our beloved community in the end. The Trinity is a very real thing at the blue level. Communion is the body and blood actually being what you receive during the communion ritual. A peak experience at blue is simply could be simply the feeling that Jesus died for you, right? Jesus died for me. A real deep connection with the love that Jesus had for me, as told to me by the Word of God, as told to me through the Bible, and that God's love was for the world, and his love was so great that he sent his only Son. And these are very real things that happened, very real things that I can put into place in my life. I'm going to say that I want to point out here real quick, though, that the words good and evil, while they tend to show up at the traditional conformist level, the words good and evil didn't exist in the original language of Jesus, right? We now know through reading some of the more Gnostic or Coptic Gospels that the words, the original Aramaic language for these things, for what we now call good and evil, according to the King James translation, The words at the time in Aramaic were ripe or unripe, right? You were either open and ready to receive this love or this teaching, or you were not quite ready, not quite open and ready to receive that love or that teaching. So good and evil is something that came along later when the language was translated to Greek and then put out into the world in the majority of the translations we now have. But let's move on to orange, which is the next slide. Orange, or the modern stage, is where we start to see maybe the word existing, but we start to see some interpretation, some various translation, some wide proliferation of that word, right? And we talked about the printing press as our ability to push this word widely out into the world. We might start to see at Orange an ethical approach to Jesus and the scriptures. So you might see Christians at the Orange level, where modernism is leaning back on the spiral to self-interest. You might start to see Christians here concerned with how their spiritual tools can better their lives. You might begin to see the prosperity gospel emerge at Orange. The shadow side of that being greed, pathological abundance. You might start to see that stuff. I know Laura in one of our talks, she said, Christians at Orange still come to church regularly, but they come there to network. And I really like that way of describing it. You start to see a different approach to the same teachings. The cross might be a symbol of ultimate achievement or sacrifice. It might be because we're into text and very text-based culture. You might start to see very different readings of the same symbol at Orange, various interpretations of the same symbol at Orange. So it might be that the vertical line of the cross is the symbol for the ascending spirit, the infinite spirit of God, and that the horizontal line of the cross represents the limitations of man and the physical body. Another downside at Orange is that these rituals might take on, as we talked about, in the kind of mechanistic approaches and attitudes of modernity, these rituals might take on this rote, repetitive nature. As we see in kind of the Catholic dispensing of the sacraments, you might start to see people going through the motions with the rituals, and the rituals themselves losing a little bit of the meaning. You might start to see people continuing to show up for church, but that there's more of a rational or a social reinforcement that's based on things other than the ritual or the shared meaning. And peak experiences at Orange, you start to see Jesus and the cross as maybe an intellectual or ethical experience. You start to see visions of Jesus as a healer and a teacher for the world, right? How is Jesus becoming himself greater? Jesus might himself be an idea that contains other ideas, right? At this text-based level, if we consider logos or the word as an idea, what are the ideas that idea contains? So you start to see this more kind of reasonable, rational, scientific approach to wisdom and understanding. And of course, experiencing the world and the cosmos as a vast and miraculous and wondrous machine is also a peak experience at the modern level. And of course, ourselves being an important cog in that mechanical universe. But I remember that as a teenager, I had a peak experience in nature, in the woods in Wisconsin. I just spontaneously collapsed. I fell to my knees in the woods. I don't remember what brought it on. It was spontaneous. I fell to my knees, and I had this vision of the universe, of the galaxy, spinning, and it was like a big vinyl record. I remember it spinning around, and there was this sound. The New Agers like to say that the universe creates the tone of B flat or something, and there's this tone, there's a sound that actually the movements of the planets creates. And that there was this real sense of the system of the universe making music, and that I was drop dead in the center of it, right on the rim of this track, and it was dragging around me like I was the needle on a record. And so this idea of that you are the needle and the universe is the record is a very mechanistic way to experience revelation. But it's revelation nonetheless, right? So that's what a peak experience might look like for someone at Orange. Let's go on next to green, which is postmodern, right? So if Orange or modern is text-based, then postmodern or green is context-based, right? This is where we start to move into this shared sense of communitarian knowledge, right? And here's where other people's images and ideas of Jesus become okay, right? The way I look at Jesus, the way I experience Christ is the way I do. And if my neighbor experiences him differently, well, then that's okay, right? We can coexist together. Because here at the stage of postmodernity, you've got the body of Christ is really the people, right? The church, you might not even need a building at this point, right? Like we're meeting in the city parks and experiencing church outdoors and in nature. Really, the church is people. That's the body of Christ at the green level. And then where we're unpacking ideas at green, maybe Jesus is the realization of that divine idea. And that's where Jesus starts to come into being and becoming as a real idea in the world. It shows up differently, right? That God energy shows up differently in different zip codes and different cultures at different times. It's no less real of a divine idea. It's a very real idea. The cross at green could be could be read metaphysically. It could become more and more symbolic. It's of course symbolic of the resurrection, but here at green it could be symbolic of a salvation that is available to all sentient beings, right? You start to see an ever widening and ever more inclusive attitude and approach to the Christian faith at green. And from being in the Unity Church and being in metaphysics, there is also this idea of the cross, meaning that you are crossing out negative thought. That there is a denial process before you move to the affirmation process, right? There is an affirmative prayer process that demands that you clear the hovel first of what you are denying yourself and make room for what you need to make manifest in your own life. And so the cross becomes this crossing out of the negative thoughts that we sometimes self-reinforce. Obviously, peak experience at green is going to be we are all connected, right? We are all one. And we've all, I'm sure, said that at one point in our life. We are all one. Where it's a universal values, universal mind. You might just start to see the borders fall down between the masculine and feminine properties of God at green to the degree that Jesus might appear somewhat blurred. Right? He might start to take on elements from different cultures, or he might start to appear as both masculine and feminine, or interchangeable as such at different times. Let's move on to yellow. So yellow is where we approach integrative or integral value systems. And so here, again, this is the enlightened self-interest, right? This is the first stage, what's called Tier 2. This is where you move to the ability to include all the previous stages that came before. So at integral or integrative, you're starting to experience a very direct identity with Source, with God, with the Father. The enlightened self, right, really is Christ consciousness in the world. You're starting to see the cross represented as maybe a blended system of symbols from different traditions. You know, the 12 powers in unity is a blending of the apostles and the chakras and the range of human emotions and the energetic centers in the body. You start to see this 12 powers mapping process happen. You start to see something like the Enneagram or even the 4 paths of creation spirituality. Any of these things can be taken in line with the symbology of the cross at an integrative level. Jesus is the ultimate enlightened master. He is the one who is the exemplar, right, the great teacher. You might start to see, well, here's the thing, in Paul Smith, actually, we talked about a little bit about Paul Smith and Tom Thresher actually emerging here, I would say like 5 to 8 years ago, with something actually called Integral Christianity. And for Paul Smith, and you can actually get his book, it's called Integral Christianity. What he talks about are these big three value spheres. He talks about the inner face of God. This is where you're resting as God. This is the first person perspective. He talks about the intimate face of God, where we relate to God. That's the second person perspective. And the infinite face of God, where we reflect about God, or the third person perspective. And so you start to see kind of the traditional Christian tools being synthesized and mapped onto integral structures, right, that are synthesizing the big three value spheres and starting to incorporate ideas like spiral dynamics that we unfold and are constantly unfolding, as Whitehead pointed out. A peak experience at Yellow could be, in addition to something like the Green Man or various other cultural imagery that might appear. You might also see the Sacred Heart of Jesus actually as very real inside you, but also connecting to all beings, right? All sentient beings. And this is where we get into kind of the metta bhavana and the Buddhist teachings that teach compassion for all beings. That at this extremely radically inclusive level of Christianity, that is what the Sacred Heart of Jesus becomes. Right? And the integral then directive would be, how do we then put that into practice? How do we put that into the world? Does the Sacred Heart of Jesus then become the habitat for humanities and the service in our direct communities? And how are we building structures then, in addition to the interpersonal relationships and the personal intention and meaning? How are we building structures in the world in third-person truth and reality to make that integral Christianity a thing that is experienced? And so I want to, so we'll move on now to turquoise, which is the mystical stage of development. And this is where, again, the cross is just, all boundaries are just gone at this point, right? The cross is just salvation for all beings in all worlds. If there's beings on other planets at this point, they're saved, right? They're swallowed up in this salvation. There's no escaping this salvation. Christ consciousness exists and unfolds in all directions, right? Inward, outward, as Fillmore put it, Christward. It's something that just is imbued in all of matter, right? In all of nature. And again, the ultimate sacrifice at turquoise is for the planet. And so when we talk about sacrifice in the Christian tradition, we're talking about sacrificing ourselves for all beings, for the entire world. We're talking about a cosmological degree of compassion. So a peak experience at mystical is, I mean, obviously there's no boundary between Jesus and God and myself. It's all one. It's all one and unified. And I think the closest thing here to a description would be Desjardins' omega point, which we talked a little bit about what he envisioned as the degree in which and he puts it here as a hypercentration of cosmic matter, or the peak created by the convergence of the evolving universe upon itself. That's what Desjardins predicted as the omega point, predicted as the real fruition of Christ consciousness. And so again, this unified, boundaryless experience. So what do we have next, Katie? I think we have yeah, here we go. I mean, we've just been talking about Christianity, right? And we're just talking about mapping this spiral onto one religious faith. And we can do the same in any of these religious structures. We can talk about Judaism and the spectrum and how it ranges from Hasidic to Orthodox to contemporary and liberal structures all the way through to the mystical Kabbalah. We could talk about Islamic forms and how there are orthodox and literal readings and teachings of the Quran and some of the more radical readings of that. We could talk about Salafism and moderate Islam, liberal, mystical Islam like Sufism, and Gurdjieff, and we can talk about the whirling dervishes and the ecstatic dances of the Sufis. There's a whole rich spectrum inside of Islam as well. We could talk about Buddhism and the spectrum from the traditional kind of Theravada to the kind of widely reaching Mahayana greater vehicle to the Vajrayana, and then the smaller branches of the tree like Shambhala and Tibetan Buddhism that are coming onto the scene recently, and then the integral Buddhism that Ken Wilber promotes in what he calls the fourth turning of the wheel of Dharma. Buddhism itself continues to evolve and continues to evolve. And even in Hinduism, we could talk about how Ganesha can be a remover of obstacles either for your personal growth and personal development, or Ganesha could remove the obstacles to power for you, right? And if you were at Orange, Ganesha would be blazing a trail for world domination and blowing those enemies down as the leader of the army, which he is according to the mythology. And also Lakshmi and her gold coins that some might read as an abundance of wisdom, and really just take to heart the openness and the exchanging energy of the universe. Or somebody at Orange could read Lakshmi's gold coins as the windfall of wealth, that is coming into their life. So there's many applications in all the traditions for this model. Excuse me, y'all. So that brings us to the end of this, and I really want to open this up for people to ask questions and react to this material. I mean, if you've got stories about how this stuff has shown up in your life, we want to hear it. So I welcome you to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away.